rulings or judgments. Then he clarified the judgments when he said, there are 7 revelatory rulings: obligation, recommended, permissible, unlawful, disliked or detested, valid and invalid. So we might have to look into these words. We'll think twice about them as we talk. We'll see, inshallah. So fiqh is the knowledge of these 7, i.e., knowledge of their details, the obligations, the recommendations, the permissions, the prohibitions, the disliked, the valid deeds, and the invalid deeds. That this act is obligatory, for example, and that is recommended, and this is permissible, and that is forbidden, and this is disliked, and this is valid, and that is invalid. That's fiqh. Knowing those judgments, knowing the details, knowing the definitions of these mentioned judgments is not what is intended. We're not saying that fiqh is knowing the definitions of these 7. What are their names and how to define them? Because that is part of the knowledge of Usul al-Fiqh, not the knowledge of fiqh. Knowing the names and the definitions of these judgments is from Usul al-Fiqh. But knowing the judgments themselves, meaning the judgments of the cases, knowing the details, that's just fiqh. What most scholars are upon is that there are actually only 5 religious judgments: obligation, recommendation, permissibility, dislikedness, or something like that, and prohibition. For the author to count them as 7 is his own terminology, because the valid would be either obligatory or otherwise, and the invalid is prohibited. Then he began to define the judgments that he cited by mentioning what is inherent in each. All right. So before we go further, let's clarify something. It's going to come, inshallah ta'ala. So when it comes, we'll repeat it. You know how we learned about the attributes of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, that Allah has attributes and that Allah has names? And didn't we say that the names of Allah could be called attributes of Allah, except the name Allah? Not the name Allah, but that the names of Allah, besides the name of Allah, could be called attributes of Allah. So what's the difference between the name and the attribute? If we understand that there, we can understand something here. So Allah has attributes like al-ilm, knowledge, and al-qudrah, power. Okay, so al-ilm and al-qudrah, those are attributes of Allah. Allah has names like al-qadir, the powerful, and al-alim, the knowledgeable. So one is the attribute and one is the name, or let's use a different word, the description. The description. One is the attribute and one is the description. It might be said Allah is described as powerful because he has the attribute of power. He is described as knowledgeable because he has the attribute of knowledge. So, like that difference between the attribute and the name, also here, there's a judgment. And then there's a description, which is the thing itself. You describe it with the judgment. So, for example, wujub is the judgment. That means obligatory. That's a judgment. It's not a description. Wujub. So if something has that judgment, as if to say, if it has that attribute, then you describe it as wajib, and it's wajib. So wujub is the judgment. Wajib is the description. Hurmah, prohibition, is the judgment. Haram is the description. So let's back up real quick. He said, there are 7 revelatory rulings. Wajib, that's a description. So you describe a thing as obligatory. It is obligatory. So here I'd say that word should be obligatory. There are 7 revelatory rulings. Wajib, obligatory. Mandub, that's a description. Recommended. Mubah, permissible, that's a description. Mahzur, prohibited, unlawful, that's a description. Makruh, disliked or detested, that's a description. Valid, sahih, valid, and batil, invalid. Those are all descriptions, not the judgments themselves. Now we're going to come back and talk about that difference again, insha'Allah ta'ala. But now let's just read and see what does he say. Then he began to define the judgments that he cited by mentioning what is inherent in each. An obligatory act is that whose performance is rewarded and whose non-performance is punished. Meaning that the obligatory, as far as an act being described as an obligation, is what is rewardable for doing and punishable for abandoning. So here, while we're talking now, don't worry about that difference. Is it the judgment or is it the description? Don't worry about that right now. It's going to come back. Now, just think about it as the judgment. That's it. It's fine. So now we just want to talk about the judgments. If it were said, your statement, punishable for abandoning, dictates definite punishment for everyone who leaves out an obligation, and that is not necessary. Let's back up a little bit. Now he wants to define obligatory. So he's going to define obligatory and then subject himself to criticism. So he said, an obligatory act is whose performance is rewarded and whose non-performance is punished. Doing it is rewardable, leaving it out is punishable. Meaning the obligatory, as far as an act being described as an obligation, is what is rewardable for doing and punishable for abandoning. So let's somebody argue with us. If it were said, your statement, punishable for abandoning, dictates definite punishment for everyone who leaves out an obligation, and that is not necessary. So how is your definition correct then? We already believe that somebody might not do an obligation and then not be punished. So how did you define an obligation as something that if you don't do it, there's punishment? The answer is, it is sufficient for punishment for abandoning to be true. Punishment for abandoning. It is true for punishment for abandoning to be true that punishment be inflicted on one sinner while the rest are forgiven. So if even one person was punished, then it's true. Then the definition would be true, even if the rest were forgiven. It may also be said what is meant by punishable for abandoning is deserving punishment, as said by several scholars, and that does not negate forgiveness. So it's still a true definition. A recommended act, as far as a deed being described as a recommendation, is that whose performance is rewarded and whose non-performance is not punished. Not punished. Yes, thank you. A recommended act, as far as a deed being described as a recommendation, is that whose performance is rewarded and whose non-performance is not punished. I think that's clear. If you have any question, go ahead. A permissible act, as far as a deed being described with permissibility, is that whose performance is not rewarded, nor is its abandonment. Abandoning it also is not rewarded, and whose non-performance is not punished. There's no punishment for not doing it, nor is its performance. There's no punishment for doing it also. This means that neither reward nor punishment pertains to doing it or abandoning it. It is neutral. An unlawful act, as far as a deed being described with prohibition, is that whose non-performance is rewarded. Not doing it is rewardable, the unlawful. If that were out of obedience, and whose performance is punished. Doing it is punishable. A disliked act, as far as a deed being described with or as disliked, is that whose non-performance is rewarded out of obedience and whose performance is not punished. All right, now we want to talk, after mentioning these 5 judgments, which are the actual judgments. Didn't Imam al-Haramayn say there are 7 judgments? And then we said, well, most scholars said there are 5 because the other 2 go back to the 5. So now we talked about the 5. Before we talk about the next 2, let's talk about something. We have only restricted gain of reward for abandoning the forbidden and the disliked to being out of obedience because one is out of range of the forbidden or disliked by merely not doing them, even if he did not realize, let alone intending to abandon it. However, reward is not warranted unless obedience was intended, meaning, okay, here's the question. How would someone get reward for not doing something? How do you get reward for not doing something? So that's what we're talking about. How do you get reward for not doing something? You get reward for not doing the haram. You get reward for not doing the makruh. But you have to have a good intention to not do it. Why are we saying that? Because you're already not doing it. You're just not engaged in it. So you're not doing it, then how do you get reward? Then you have to correct your intention. So we have only restricted gain of reward for abandoning the forbidden and the disliked to being out of obedience because one is out of range of the forbidden or disliked by merely not doing them, even if he did not realize, let alone intending to abandon it. However, reward is not warranted unless obedience was intended. Now, somebody might argue with us. If it were said, well, likewise, reward for doing the obligations and recommendations is not warranted unless obedience was intended. Same thing. Why did you say unless obedience was intended for the makruh and the haram when it's also true about the obligation in the sunnah? Obedience has to be intended. So, are you being inconsistent or frivolous? The answer is, this is true. However, since many of the obligations are fundamentally invalid unless obedience is intended, and that is every obligation that is not valid without an intention, there was no need to mention the restriction. Meaning, the obligation and the sunnah, many of them will not even be initiated without you making an intention. If you didn't make an intention, it won't even start. So that was the difference. That's what made the difference in our wording. So what the criticizer is saying to us is true. This is the reason why we explained ourselves like that. This is still true despite some obligations being lifted by merely doing them, such as support of dependents, returning items taken by force and return of trusts, fulfilling debts, and other things that are valid without an intention. However, there is no reward deserved unless obedience is intended, and Allah knows best. Meaning, what about the other obligations that if you do them, even if you didn't have an intention, they're valid? Like, you paid someone their money back, or you provided for your family, or something like that. Then that person, what he said is still true. So there is no reward unless obedience was intended. That's true, but that's not the origin of the obligations and the sunnahs. The origin of the obligation and the sunnah is that the person has to seek it and he corrects his intention. And then he gets the reward. And then there are things that if he does them without an intention, they are valid, but he will miss the reward. Also, the lifting of najasa or covering the awrah. Let it be known that the reward for doing the deed or the punishment for leaving it out is something inherent in the deed and is not the reality of the deed itself. The prayer, for example, is an issue conceived and imagined in itself, the standing and bowing and prostrating. And it is not the actual gaining of reward or punishment by being done or abandoned. You might do the prayer and you have no reward. You might do the prayer and you have reward. So the aforementioned definition, when we said the obligation is that if you do it, you get reward. If you don't do it, there's punishment. The haram is if you do it, there's punishment. If you don't do it, there's reward. All right, well, praying is not the reward, for example. Or drinking alcohol is not the punishment. Let it be known that the reward for doing the deed or the punishment for leaving it out is something inherent in the deed and is not the reality of the deed itself. The prayer, for example, is an issue conceived and imagined in itself and is not the actual gaining of reward or punishment by being done or abandoned. So the aforementioned definition does not define the obligation in reality, as it is not possible to define its reality due to the many types of obligatory matters and their various realities. Sheikh Samir told us that. The prayer, the fasting. He said, if someone asks you, what is the obligation? Then you'd have to say the prayer, the fasting, the zakah, the hajj, this and this and this. So it's not really possible to define the obligation. So the aforementioned definition does not define the obligation in reality, as it is not possible to define its reality due to the many types of obligatory matters and their various realities. This is also true about the rest of the judgments. To say, what is the haram, what is the makruh? What is instead intended is clarifying the description they all share. Here's where you need to know the difference between the judgment and the description. The judgment is wujub, obligatory. The salah it has the description, it has that attribute, so it's wajib or wajibah. The siyam is wajib. What is instead intended is clarifying the description they all share to label one act with the term obligation, for example, and another with the term prohibition, etc., while each act has its own reality. Imagine a factory. You work at a factory and things go past you on the conveyor belt and it's your job to stamp them. So one thing goes by, you stamp it, inspect it. So now you labeled it, inspected, inspected, inspected. So this one not inspected, for example, or this one faulty or whatever. So being inspected is not the thing itself, right? It's a quality that the thing has. So what is instead intended is clarifying the description they all share to label one act with the term obligation, for example, and another with the term prohibition, etc., while each act has its own reality. This is why it is not possible to truly define these 5 judgments. Then we go back to talk about the next 2 or the last 2 judgments that the author discussed. A valid act, as far as a deed being described with validity, so validity would be the judgment and valid would be the description, is that which leads to what it is intended for, meaning that which leads to the achievement of the goal, such as the legality of benefiting from a sale, If it was valid, you can benefit from whatever it was you transacted or exchanged. And of sexual pleasure from marriage, it became legal. And it counts by the religious law, i.e., it is recognized by the religious law. Recognition is by gathering what is religiously considered, meaning doing the integrals. Recognition is by gathering the integrals, or fulfilling the integrals, fulfilling the conditions, and avoiding the invalidators. Whether for a contract or a worship, or a dealing or a worship. And that's fiqh. Fiqh is pretty much two things, is worships and dealings. When we say dealings, it includes contracts and it includes other types of dealings. Dealings amongst people like assaults. Someone assaulted another, then now he maybe has to pay him, or being a witness, or being a judge, or having a slave, for example, or inheritance, etc. So recognition is by gathering what is religiously considered, whether for a contract or a worship. Completion is from the performer of the act. And recognition is from God, the lawmaker. It was said that they have the same meaning. An invalid act, as far as a deed being described with invalidity, is that which does not lead to what it is intended for, and it does not count. It did not gather what is needed to be religiously considered, whether a contract or a worship. The contract or dealing, according to dealing is a more broad term. The dealing, according to the religious terminology, is described with fulfillment and recognition, while the worship is described only with recognition. It may be called fasid or batil, except in the case of Hajj. Except in the case of Hajj, which is, to remind you, what happens in the case of Hajj. In Hajj you have fasad and butlan. Fasad means corruption, butlan means invalidation. Usually they mean the same thing. So if you corrupted your fast, you invalidated it. In Hajj, if you, let's say, corrupted your Hajj, you have to continue doing it and then you have to make it up. You can't stop. Whereas, and that would be by sexual intercourse. Whereas if you invalidated your Hajj, you stop dead in your tracks, you're done, and you have to make it up. And that would be by apostasy.